everybody. Today we're going to finish up the Unit 4 review. I want to thank those of you who went out to the College Board site yesterday, did the AP demo. I apologize those of you who went on before like 4 o'clock. They had not sent out an email yet. Those of you who went out after 4 o'clock, they obviously had. So that's something that I don't think will be problematic going into your test, though I do want to advise everybody that your test is going to be next Tuesday, so 1 week from today. They are supposed to send out your invitation email for this test 2 days before. So at 4 o'clock on Sunday is when they're supposed to send out the email for your class. So please check your email, make sure that you can see the invitation. It'll have your AP ID on it. Some of you asked me for that. You can see that if you log into AP Classroom, it has that available there. If you don't see an email Sunday at 4 o'clock, please check AP Classroom, see if you have an invitation there. If you do, great. You have what you need. If you don't, please let me know ASAP, and we will try to get that worked out with the College Board. I know Mr. Summer and I are prepared to deal with some stuff this weekend if we need to, because my Gov class is on Monday. You guys are on Tuesday. So got a lot of things coming up this weekend. So please check for that email Sunday. I don't think they'll send it until 2 days exactly before your test, so 4 o'clock Sunday. So please look for that there. Okay, for those of you who are wanting to do some actual practice tests, the thing that they sent you, the demo thing, was obviously not a test. I do want to draw your attention to something that they've started doing through the College Board. So out on the AP website, I just went out, I Googled AP Human Geography, and it takes you to this page right here. This is the main page, course page for the class. Right in the middle, it says Watch YouTube Classes. And I mentioned this a couple times earlier this year. They have on AP Classroom been doing review classes for every single unit in this course. So obviously they started with 6 and 7, which is stuff that isn't directly tested on our test here, but it is stuff that they could link to it. That was a lot of the city type things that we did in those last couple units. Here you can see we've got the population unit, culture, agriculture, political that we're doing right now. Okay, all of those things are reviewed there. They've got some general skills processes from across the course. They talk about spatial, data analysis, source analysis, all of that stuff. So there's some really good videos out here. The big thing that I think is going to impact all of you, if you want to get some practice in, is that on Monday, so yesterday, they did their first AP timed practice. So what they do is they're going to set a video, and they're going to set the clock the same way that it would be on the test. So you can practice going through 2 questions. So what they're going to do, I'm shooting this video on Monday, so right now you can see where it says live here. This will be with that red box. This will not be live when you're viewing this. This will be something that you can go out to and you can access that timed test. They'll give you a little bit of guidance before it starts. They'll do 2 timed questions that you can practice. On Tuesday, generally in the afternoon, about 5 o'clock is when they do the geography class. So at 5 o'clock today, on Tuesday, they will have the review of that timed practice test. So you can kind of review what you missed, what you should improve upon in terms of your writing there. They will do another one of these on Wednesday with the answers on Thursday. So you can see that these 4 of the last 5 videos here, practice test, review, practice test, review, and then a final lesson with some tips and things that they'll have for you on Friday. So those will be the last videos that they're going to push out there. But if there's specific things that we go through that you want a little bit additional review on, there are tons of videos out here. And the teacher here is pretty good at getting through this material in a way that I think is very understandable. So if there's anything that you have questions about, obviously feel free to email me. I know I've been responding to a lot of emails about specific topics. But if there's specific questions you have, obviously talk to me. But if there's things that you just think I'd like a little bit more review over culture than what we did last week, then there's 2 review videos out here on culture, which I think are very, very good that can help you. But I would strongly recommend, I'm not doing this for a grade. Obviously, we're done with grades in here right now. But I would strongly recommend everybody to go out here and to do these 2 timed practice tests, just to give yourself a little bit of practice as to what the test date is going to be like. Obviously, this is the last day that any of your teachers can assign any new work, so hopefully you'll have a little bit more free time in terms of work over the next couple days than you've had trying to frantically get everything done here right at the end of the quarter. So again, very, very helpful. Strongly recommend that everybody goes out and takes a look at those at your convenience. Okay. All right. Let's go back to the AP Geography site. Okay, I'm going to scroll down here and go back to the document that we've been working from for the last few days. We have our course and exam description document. I'm going to click on that. I'm going to scroll down to our table of contents here and go back to Unit 4. So yesterday we started through the first 4 of these topics here. I'm going to finish the last 6 of these today, just in terms of some terminology. So we talked about the different types of boundaries yesterday. I had a couple of really good questions that were emailed to me, particularly as it relates to superimposed boundaries. So a superimposed boundary, as we've talked about as it relates to Africa, is any time that anybody else forces a boundary upon you. So obviously African boundaries are the best example of this, but if there's any other region in the world, and you could even look at this from the relationship of India and Pakistan, their initial boundaries were set by Great Britain. So that's something that would also be a superimposed boundary. When the Soviet Union broke up, they broke up into those 15 different states that were based upon ethnicity, but the boundaries of those states were not necessarily set by those states. They were set by the Soviet Union as it was part of the agreement to basically break up into pieces. They agreed to what those boundaries were going to be. So that would also be a superimposed boundary. So anything like that, when a boundary that is not set by you or your choice is kind of forced upon you, that would be superimposed. So Africa is obviously the best example of that, but there are many others. Okay, so 4.5 is on the function of political boundaries, and the learning objective for this one was to explain the nature and function of international and internal boundaries. So we've got 4 pieces of essential knowledge here. It says first that boundaries are defined, delimited, demarcated, and administered to establish limits of sovereignty, but they are often contested, and this is a really important piece here, is that a lot of boundaries around the world are not set in stone. In the United States, we don't really experience this much because we know very clearly where the U.S.-Mexico border is, where the U.S.-Canada border is. But there are many, many disputed pieces of territory all over the world that make boundaries in some cases unknown. So obviously, Western Sahara is a disputed region in Morocco. We've talked a lot about that. But even within certain countries, there may be a mile or two of territory that depending upon which map you look at, could be drawn a little bit differently. I know there's several regions in China's border that are disputed, whether it be with India, Pakistan, Russia, or Mongolia. There's a bunch of pieces of their border where China thinks the border is here and somebody else thinks it's there. So borders can be unclear sometimes as to what those are looking at. Okay. Part 2 here says political boundaries often coincide with cultural, national, and economic divisions. We've already talked about that. However, some boundaries are created by demilitarized zones or policy, such as the Berlin Conference. So this kind of go back to some of those things. Obviously, a demilitarized zone is an area where fighting is not allowed, or that's kind of like a neutral zone in some sense. That is something that if you look at the boundary of North and South Korea, you should have a pretty good idea of what that looks like. There's like this 2-mile border between the two countries where there's no fighting. That's kind of like a neutral area between those countries. Boundaries are created by policy, and it says such as the Berlin Conference. If you remember, the Berlin Conference was what happened when we kind of drew up the lines for Africa. So the scramble for Africa really began at the Berlin Conference, where we met to kind of set up what that was going to look like as it relates to Africa. So those are political boundaries that can be set by policy. Part B3 says land and maritime boundaries and international agreements can influence national or regional identity and encourage or discourage international or internal interactions and disputes over resources. So obviously maritime boundaries, that's water boundaries, are oftentimes a point of contention. We talked about the fact that the U.S. owns roughly 20 miles from our shores all around. That's our territorial waters that we have exclusive economic rights in. That's why a lot of countries want island possession. So the fact that the United States owns Guam in Southeast Asia gives us territorial waters around Guam. So it allows us to control some of the oceans around that. It's reasons why countries have claimed regions of Antarctica. That gives them not only the land and whatever resources might be there, but it also gives them water rights around that. And some countries have territorial possessions such as Greenland for Denmark that are really part of their identity. Denmark is significantly larger in terms of their territorial possessions when you include Greenland than if you didn't. Obviously, Greenland is bigger than Denmark, so the fact that they own that land is significant and is part of their identity as a nation. And then finally, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas defines the rights and responsibilities of nations in the use of international waters, established territorial seas, and exclusive economic zones. So an exclusive economic zone is what I was just kind of mentioning a second ago, where countries control the water around their land. So if I am the United States, I control 20 to 200 miles outside my land. There's things I can do 20 miles out. There's other things that I can do 200 miles out. From my land. Everything beyond that is what's considered international water. So if you are in international water, nobody owns that. So you can't go and drill in international water or things like that. So countries have to respect international water and what that looks like as it relates to what they can and can't do in certain regions. So international water is key, and this is why a lot of those Atlantic Ocean islands that I had you look at for your map quiz are so important, is that whenever a country owns one of those, that gives them possession of the water around it, which can shrink some of the international waters that may exist out in the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. So this was established by what's called UNCLOS. It's United Nations Convention Law of Sea. So that's kind of the idea there, UNCLOS, that kind of established what you could or couldn't do in certain areas of water around your country. Okay. Internal boundaries. This is where we get into some of the stuff that we covered last year in AP Government or Regular Government if you took Regular Gov. This is looking at voting districts, redistricting, gerrymandering. Obviously, please make sure you know that congressional districts have to be redrawn after every U.S. census. So we're having our census right now in 2020. Once that is counted, this will be the last election, this election here in November, in which we will use the current current congressional districts that are in place and the current counts per state. We will redraw these lines. We will tally things up after this census to determine how many seats in Congress each state will get, and then how those states are gonna redistrict their lines. So remember, there's 3 different terms here. Okay, so redistricting, reapportionment, and gerrymandering. So reapportionment is just simply counting up how many seats each state gets and what the population of each one of those seats happens to be. So if Ohio is determined to get 14 seats because we have whatever 14 divided by 435 is, we have that percentage of the United States population. If we get 14 seats, what is the total population of Ohio? Divide that by 14. That's how big each one of those districts has to be. So that would be the process of reapportionment. So it's just counting. Okay, redistricting is when you draw the line. So now that we know that each district has to have, let's say, 700,000 people in it, let's draw the lines in Ohio such that each district has 700,000 people in it. So when you do that, and you aren't doing it with an agenda to benefit anybody or to hurt anyone, that's just simply called redistricting. When you are doing that with an agenda to benefit your political party, or in some cases to disadvantage a racial group or an ethnic group, then that's called gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is technically legal. It is illegal if you're doing it specifically for the purposes of discriminating on the basis of race or ethnicity. If you're doing it to discriminate against a political party, the court has ruled that that is fine, but you can't do it to discriminate specifically against a racial or ethnic group. Okay, so there was an extended response a few years ago on this topic. Wouldn't be shocked if you saw something about it again. This is a concept that is very, very important. Obviously, it bleeds over a lot into government. So those of you who took AP Gov last year, I'm hoping this should be a very simple concept for you. You guys all did that gerrymandering game worksheet we did earlier this year that you should have, or I hope you still have. There's some good information on that in terms of terms that you should know, in terms of the way that lines are drawn and things are divvied up that can definitely help you as you look back over this. Okay. Forms of government. Okay, now, I want to talk about a couple terms, and we did mention this briefly in class, but I want to really kind of reiterate this because this was on the AP test a couple years ago. the difference between what's known as a unitary state versus a federal state. We've got different forms of government, and we'll go back over some of the other ones here in a second, anocracies, autocracies, things like that we talked about earlier this year. But I want to kind of start with this idea of unitary versus federal state. Okay, unitary obviously means one. Federal, and if you remember last year from government, federalism is the sharing of power between state and federal governments. So a unitary state is a state or a country in which all the power is centrally located. Okay, federal government has all the power. Okay, a federal state is one in which power is broken up between the federal government and states states have certain powers, federal government has certain powers. So the thing I want you to pay attention to here, and this was actually an AP question a few years ago, they drew a map of two countries. One was just in one piece and one was divided up into a bunch of states. They asked to identify which one was unitary and which one was federal, and then to kind of explain why based upon what those terms mean. So obviously, if something doesn't have subdivisions, then that would be a unitary state. If something does have subdivisions, that would be a federal state. So it says here, unitary states tend to have a more top-down, centralized form of governments, while federal states have more locally based, dispersed power centers. So if you look at the United States, we're a federal system. Each state has a lot of things that state gets to do. That are really outside the scope of the federal government. So if you remember last year from government class, we talked about police powers, so health, safety, and welfare. Anything having to do with health, safety, and welfare, those are state powers. If you look at the response to COVID-19, each state gets to make their own decisions as to when they're going to open up and how they're going to go through this process. So that's something that you would see in a federal system that you wouldn't see in a unitary system. So I want to make sure that everybody's familiar with those two terms, since they have asked that before. This also goes back, and you see there on the top left, it says available resources, classroom resources on scale. We talked back in Unit 1 about this idea of the scale at which we look at things. So obviously, if we're looking at things broadly, nationwide, at a national scale, we're generally looking at a unitary form of government. If we're looking at subdivisions of a government, whether it be a state, a county, a city, things like that, then that's going to be a smaller scale, local scale, regional scale, something like that. So they could reference, obviously, types of scale here as well. Hey, 4.8 talks about defining devolutionary factors. So it says here, enduring understanding, political, economic, cultural, or technological changes can challenge state sovereignty. So obviously there's a lot of things that can challenge the power of a state. And I think China is a great example of something that we could look at here. So obviously China wants to maintain their communist form of government, maintaining a lot of government control over the people. And the things that could stop them from doing that would be any of these things here: political, economic, cultural, or technological. Now, an economic change that happened with China is that their democracy is very different. Their government is very different because they've instilled some elements of democracy, but a lot of elements of capitalism into their economy. Soviet Union fell apart mainly because of their economy, and China was trending in that direction as we moved through the 1960s until they opened their economy up to the outside and they allowed some elements of supply and demand and overseas demand to influence how their economy works. So that was an economic challenge that, if that had continued, might have sunk the communist Chinese government. They adapted to fix that. Obviously, technological changes, allowing people to see what's going on outside of China, to see the freedoms that some of the people there don't have, is a challenge to their government. So that's a technological change that can challenge their sovereignty. So it says there under essential knowledge, a learning objective is to define factors that lead to the devolution of states. And devolution of states is just power going back to local or subdivisions of people. So things aren't being federal, but they're kind of bouncing back to the people. And it talks about some things. So we have the division. It talks about the division of people by physical geography. So obviously, if we have people divided up into pieces within a country, that makes it very easy to kind of pass power back from the federal government down to a local level if people are kind of chunked out into regions. And I think there's some good examples of this. Like if you look at the United States, obviously you have a lot of people on the West Coast, you have a lot of people on the East Coast, you have a good chunk of people to the Midwest where we are, and then we basically have nobody through the Montana, Wyoming, Dakotas and that region. So it's very easy to kind of separate the West out from the rest of the country if we were looking to kind of dissolve power. And we kind of see that now with the reopening of our government, is that the Western states are all working together. So you're seeing Washington and Oregon and California all kind of pooling together and making common decisions because they're breaking down by physical geography. Ethnic separatism obviously is another way in which a country can devolve. Kind of putting things back down to local levels, is that people could want to separate based on their ethnicity, and we're seeing this in Canada with Quebec. We saw it in South Sudan, breaking away from Sudan because of ethnicity. So that's examples of devolution there. Obviously, we talked about ethnic cleansing and the difference between ethnic cleansing and genocide. Ethnic cleansing is basically when you want to remove an ethnic group from a region. Genocide is when you do that by killing them. Ethnic cleansing could just mean just to get people to leave. Now, obviously, we tend to use those terms synonymously because generally ethnic cleansing results in genocide. So that's one of the reasons why we kind of lump those terms together, but they're not necessarily the same thing. Obviously, you know what terrorism is. Obviously, economic and social problems can cause government to kind of split apart. And then irredentism, and that's a term that we didn't really mention. It was in your notes for Chapter 9. We didn't really talk about it a whole lot. Irredentism is this idea of restoring to a country entering territory that used to belong to it. So this was a big thing during World War II, is that after the First World War, Germany was forced to give up some land to other nations. They were forced to forfeit some land, some of it to France, some of it to Poland, things like that. Now, when Hitler came to power, one of the things that he wanted to do was to restore all of former Germany back into current Germany. So what he wanted to do is he invaded and brought some of those pieces of territory back into the nation of Germany. That's the idea of irredentism. So any sort of restoring to a country any former territory that used to belong to it. So if Great Britain decided, you know what, we're going to come back and invade the United States because we want to regain our former territory, that would be irredentism. We see this a lot in countries where boundaries are a little bit more fluid than we are here. We see fighting in India and Pakistan over the region of Kashmir that we talked about, which is part of the reason why those two countries are nuclear threats over that idea. We see fighting in a lot of our African countries where some borders may change. The country of Eritrea was created because of fighting, and now Ethiopia has been trying to get that back. Obviously, Sudan would love to regain South Sudan. So there's this idea of being able to bring territory back to you. Is kind of these things that can lead a government to have some issues as it relates to their sovereignty. Okay. 4.9 talks about other challenges to state sovereignty. It talks about fragmented regions, and we've already kind of talked about this a little bit. We've talked about Belgium. We talked about the two different regions of Belgium, Wallonia and Flanders, that are very, very different on the basis of language. There's been discussion about splitting those two off into separate countries. Obviously, Quebec has talked a lot about that. Nigeria, with their 1,000 ethnic groups and languages that exist there, there's been talk about splitting Nigeria into pieces. Then we have places where it has happened already. So I talked about Eritrea a second ago, which split off from Ethiopia. South Sudan, East Timor was a fairly new country in the 1990s. And then all of our former Soviet republics split off there as well. Okay. Then it talks in this next chapter about advances in communication technology and the impacts that they've had on different terms. So facilitated devolution, which is kind of the devolving of a country down to the local level. Supranationalism. Now, if you remember, supranationalism is the idea of forming these multinational organizations. So NATO or the UN or anything like that would be a supranational organization. Now, if the United States joins a supranational organization, you can see some examples of those down in 4b, is that it talks about UN, NATO, European Union, Asian, African Union, things like that. When you join one of those groups, you forfeit some of your sovereignty. Your country has to give up some of its power to be part of this larger effort. So supranational organizations can pose a challenge to state sovereignty. Sometimes a state may not necessarily have to act in their own interest. They have to act in the group interest. Okay, and that can be a challenge to sovereignty. And then 3 there, which I kind of skipped over. It says global efforts to address transnational and environmental challenges and to create economies of scale, trade agreements, and military alliances. So talk about 2 of those terms there real quick. The idea of environmental challenges. Obviously, President Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Change Accord. That was something where countries all over the world had come together to agree to lower greenhouse gas emissions. So that was something that the U.S. did because we thought our sovereignty was being overstepped more than we wanted it to be. So that would be an issue with environmental challenges. Economies of scale would be something like OPEC. So OPEC is the oil-producing cartel that exists. You have these Middle Eastern countries in their oil production where none of them individually can compete with the U.S. or Russia or countries like that, these large countries. But together, they can create what we call economies of scale. By working together, this is something that they can produce more stuff than they would be able to do individually, and they can have more control over a market. So any of those things which force countries to work together can be a challenge to sovereignty. Now, Saudi Arabia is a member of OPEC. One of the things that we've seen recently is that Saudi Arabia's big fight with Russia over oil led Saudi Arabia to mass produce tons and tons of oil, which is why oil prices plummeted a few weeks ago. They started to come back a little bit as Saudi Arabia started to listen a little bit more to the other members of OPEC. But for a long time, or not for a long time, but for several weeks, they were kind of doing their own thing. They were ignoring their cartel, basically, and not focusing on economies of scale to help each other out. Okay, so those are all challenges to states, to the sovereignty of a state. Okay, and then we have centrifugal and centripetal forces. Now, remember the way I taught you to remember what centrifugal forces is. So centrifugal forces push people apart. Okay, centripetal forces draw people together. So centrifugal forces can lead to failed states. It says here uneven development, stateless nations, and ethnic nationalist movements. Big thing I want you to remember is that any sort of difference in people, whether it be people who speak different languages, people who practice different religions, people who have different elements of culture, can be centrifugal forces. They can drive people apart. They can force people to care more about their individual differences than they care about a country as a whole. Centripetal forces are things that draw people together. So it says here ethno-nationalism, the idea that we're all one country regardless of what our ethnicity is. And that's kind of the idea in the U.S. post 9/11, is we had all of these divisions that we saw in this country following the 2000 election that was very controversial. But after 9/11, everybody came together. So it didn't matter what people's race or ethnicity was. People all came together after 9/11. Now, very quickly, we started to scapegoat Muslims. We started to scapegoat other groups of people shortly thereafter. So that didn't last very long. But it was something that, for a short period of time, the fact that we were all American drew people together. And that was this idea of a centripetal force. Okay, and that's a significant piece there. Okay, now I want to talk about 2 other things really, really quickly here, and then we'll be done with today's review. I want to go back to the notes for this unit because there's a couple things that we did not go over. It's the wrong class. In this unit here that I want to go back over very briefly, and that's the shapes of states. Hey, I want to revisit that idea very, very quickly. Also, please remember about Arctic land claims is that nobody technically owns the North Pole, nobody technically owns Antarctica. There are many, many claims to different regions. Oftentimes those claims are overlapping, and that can be problematic as you look at that. Find the right slide here. Different types of boundaries really quick. We talked about sometimes boundaries can be deserts, they can be water boundaries, mountain boundaries. Remember the term frontiers. So a frontier is any sort of zone that no state really has any real control over. If you think about where the boundary is between, let's say, Switzerland and Italy or France or something like that, it's going to be somewhere in the Alps. Nobody has any houses there, so we roughly know where the border is. We can draw it on a map. But if you're hiking through the mountains in that area, you may not ever know where you are because that's really a frontier. Now, way back when, hundreds of years ago, we would basically say, okay, the United States controls all the territory over to there. and we would just kind of know that, okay, nobody lives over in this region, so we'll just draw a line somewhere out there. That was considered a frontier, an area where nobody really had any control. Now today, we pretty much, everybody has control over something. So we pretty much know who owns everything in the world. So that's something where there really aren't that many frontiers anymore. Okay, now let's go over these 5 shapes of states really quick, because this idea is important. Compact states are states that are roughly circular. So remember, the best example of that would be Poland. Ohio would also be a compact state. Compact states have their capital roughly in the center, and they're circle shaped. That way everybody in the country, no matter where they live, has easy access to the capital city. Poland is a great example of this because of Warsaw, right there in the middle, roughly circular country. Elongated states are long and skinny, so this would be Chile. Big problem that they used to have prior to the advent of new technology was really hard to communicate. If your capital's in the north, if you look at Chile, it's 2,500 miles long and only 90 miles wide. So if your capital was, let's say, in the north, about say 100 miles from the northern border, you would be 2,400 miles from your southern border. So that's a long way away. Even the United States, with Washington, D.C. being in the east, prior to airplanes or easy transportation, it's very hard to get from the west to the east. It took a long time to be able to do that. So that would be an elongated state. We also have what are known as prorupted states. Prorupted states are any countries that have some sort of protrusion sticking out of them. So some of our best examples of that would be in Africa. We have the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Namibia. Both of them have these little arms, these little protrusions that stick out. And the reason why those protrusions are there is to link them to some sort of resource. So to link them to water, or sometimes it can be to divide 2 other countries that don't like each other. So we're going to put this little strip here to divide the 2 between each other. So that would be a prorupted state. We then have perforated states. A perforated state is a country that completely surrounds another country. So the only real 2 perforated states anywhere in the world would be South Africa and Italy. South Africa completely surrounds Lesotho. Italy completely surrounds San Marino. It also completely surrounds the Vatican City. So those would be perforated states. Now remember, the perforated state is the one that does the surrounding. Okay, the thing that is surrounded, okay, is what's known as an enclave. So an enclave is any sort of country that's completely surrounded by another country. So San Marino or Lesotho or Vatican City would be enclaves. The perforated state would be the one that does the surrounding. Okay, and then we have what are called fragmented states, and this would be the United States. And this would be any sort of island state where you have some sort of discontinuous pieces of territory. Alaska would make the United States fragmented because there's another country between us and them. The pieces that are disconnected, so Alaska would be an example of what's called an exclave. So an exclave is a part of a country that is disconnected from the rest of that country. So that would make a country fragmented. So those are our 5 shapes of states. Please make sure that you know those. Okay. And then our last idea here I want to talk about are those 3 types of countries. So we have democracies, autocracies, and anocracies. So a democracy is any country in which citizens can actually pick their leaders. So and actually really have a say, unlike Russia where you can vote, but everybody either has to vote for Putin or they get shot in the head. So that's not really a democracy, okay? An autocracy is one where citizens really have no rights. Okay, so they don't pick anything in the government. So anything that would be a dictatorship would be an autocracy. Anything that would be an absolute monarchy would be an autocracy. The numbers of those in the world has diminished significantly. What we've seen the biggest increase in, besides democracies, is anocracies. And these are countries that have some elements of democracy, but they're not really fully democratic. So China would be one here, because you have to be a member of the Communist Party. You might be able to vote between members of the Communist Party, but if you're not communist, you can't hold office. There's a lot of other countries in the world that have elements of democracy but are not truly democratic countries. So that would be an anocracy. Okay. All right. That'll wrap up Unit 4 review. Tomorrow we'll go back and do a little bit more with Unit 2. We did a little bit of that the other day with demographic transition, but I'll spend a little bit more time on some Unit 2 things tomorrow. I would strongly encourage everyone, as I mentioned, to please go out to those College Board YouTube videos, work through some of those practice problems they're going to give you. They are timed. They will be probably the best review that you can do for the tests leading up to the test. Obviously, this class has not been modified in a long time. So if you go out to the College Board's website, just Google AP Human Geography free response questions, and you can go back to any of the free response questions that have been given in previous years. All of those should be the same, similar types of questions that you will see this year. This year they might be a little bit longer in terms of some of the questions because there's only 2 of them, but it'll be the exact same type of content. You can see the stimuli and things like that. Okay, if you have any questions over anything, please let me know. That'll wrap everything up for today. Please go out there and check out those College Board videos. Hope everybody has a great day, and I'll talk to you all tomorrow.